So, evaluating Bandura and Chaney then. Ban and Chan to their friends, what a pair. First question is, why bother? Well, apart from the exam situation, which we'll get to in a minute, the whole point of psychology in the form that we're learning is that it teaches us to be critical thinkers. By which I mean, when we see a fact being claimed, we don't sit there and say, okay, that's a fact. We question it to find out how true that fact is. I could say to you, 100,000 tests were done at the end of last month. And you could say, okay, that's good. Or you could say, 100,000 tests? Were they sent out? But were they actually done? Were the people they sent out to equipped to do the tests? Were they sent out with return bags so they could get to a lab? Those kind of questions allow you to critically evaluate a claim. The skills that the evaluation leads us with allows us to make those conclusions about whether the findings of a study, the claims of a study, the conclusions of a study are true or not. So you could be asked fairly straightforward things like, discuss the strengths and weaknesses of a study or of a particular aspect of a study, like a good thing or bad thing about its ethics, or a good thing or bad thing about the quantitative or qualitative data that it may have gathered. But being able to comment piecemeal on those things also means that we can discuss certain aspects of studies, and these are the kind of questions we get in exams. Discuss the applications of the study, which doesn't just mean what are applications of the study. Bandura, obviously we've got the watershed, we've got issues about domestic violence, etc. etc. With Chaney, far more straightforward. It actually applies to getting people to take their medicine or not, as other studies have suggested. It's got to be good for the long-term health, for the socioeconomic benefits of society, all those kind of things. So in order to answer those questions, going back to the applications, we not only would say the application of a study is the existence of the watershed, but we might go on to say that there are limitations in the applications because ultimately there are problems with the sampling or the validity of the study that's letting us draw conclusions. But I'm not going to talk about that right now because that's what we're going to go over throughout. Certain things that we can evaluate every study on, and they're kind of our golden nuggets. And there's a bit of a list here. It's not exhaustive, but it helps us to think along these lines. What were the ethics? What were the sample and the sampling technique? Was the sample ethnocentric? What are the validity issues of the measurements involved? How reliable was the study? If we don't get consistent results, then whatever we found out might have been a fluke, which is not much good to us. And other research methods issues, lab, field, quasi-experiments, self-report methods, observations. There are problems and benefits to all of these, as we know. So if you haven't already, and I hope that you have, whip up a few tables like the one that you can see here. Right now, do one for the ethics of Bandura, one for the ethics of Chaney. Pause the video and see if you can come up with 2 positives and 2 negatives for both studies on the ethics, and I'll give you my thoughts after you've done that. So a couple of positives on the ethics of Bandura's study then. First of all, if they didn't have parental permission, and it's at best unclear if they had parental permission or not, is that they most definitely had permission of the staff at the nursery who were in loco parentis. They were responsible for the children at that times. Some would argue that the children were protected because they weren't exposed to anything they may not have seen anyway, and indeed apparently lots of kids said things like, that man's a good fighter just like my daddy. What that says for either that man or the participants' daddies is for you to guess as well as me, really, but the point is that it was fairly normal behaviour. Protection then, positive. On the other hand, they couldn't get the children's consent. It's impossible to get small children's consent because they're not equipped to give consent. they couldn't withdraw. At first, they were left in the room in phase 3 by themselves, and it was only the fact they kept trying to escape that meant that the experimenter sat in there doing some paperwork while they were being observed by the male model behind the one-way mirror. So they were kind of prevented from withdrawing themselves, really. And while we just said the protection could have been considered to be a good thing, on the other hand, you know, being sat in that phase 1 where a complete stranger starts doing some pretty weird things to that Bobo doll is probably going to be a bit scary. And maybe, just maybe, we're teaching children to be aggressive, which could go through them to being aggressive in later life, getting into trouble for aggressive behaviours, detrimental effects to their future, etc. So protection maybe not so much. Chaney then, plus points. They checked the amount of drug was sufficient, equivalent to the PMDI, pressurized metered dose inhaler they were already using. So they protected them, ensuring that they were getting enough of the asthma medication they needed. They got informed consent from parents. Once again, children can't give their own assent. And then there's although it is quite an ethical study, they didn't know that adherence would be as good, if not better. It might have been worse, in which case, you know, you got issues of protection there. Couple of ethical issues for Bandura and Chaney then. Next, validity. If you haven't already, whip up a table, 2 plus points, 2 minus points, both for Bandura and for Chaney. Pause the video and then we'll continue in a second. Okie dokie, so validity, true. Was what Bandura found true? You hear validity, you think truth. There are several reasons to think it was. First of all, only objectively observable behaviour was measured and recorded. That way the participants aren't being asked to judge their own thoughts or what they might do. It's accurate, it actually happened, it was valid. That also, by the way, links into, at least in one way, to the behaviourist perspective, because one of the key concepts of behaviourism is that you should only measure objectively observable behaviour. Next, they used a matched pairs design, therefore controlling for aggression, removing a potentially confounding variable, and making it more valid. There was inter-rater reliability between the two observers. This supports the idea that each observation was accurate because they were similar. If they were inaccurate or invalid, they were both similarly invalid, but perhaps it's more likely that they were valid. And lastly, it was a blind observation in that the observer did not know which condition the participants had been in, mostly. But some of the times that model, the observer was also a model, in which case they would have known what conditions they were on. On the minus side, ecological validity. Some people say it occurred in a nursery where they go every day, so it's high ecological validity. I get that as an argument, of course. I would argue that they were taken to separate rooms away from the normal nursery, which is probably quite unsettling, so low in ecological validity. And how often do you see an adult bashing the stuffing out of some doll for 15 minutes when the adult is a total stranger and you're like between 3 and 5? Not that often, so I'd argue it's an unusual situation and not very ecological valid. Next, validity. People argue that actually the behaviour being displayed by the participants wasn't aggression, it was just playing. If they're playing, then they ain't measuring aggression. You still say they've learned some play techniques, I guess, but that wasn't really the aim of the experiment. And as we already said, sometimes the model did know what condition they were, so that could have led to them being influenced in whether they said that it was aggressive or non-aggressive behaviour. And Chaney then, high validity, ecological validity. It occurred in the participant's house, which means it's a normal situation, and you would think their behaviour in their own house would be representative of their behaviour in their own house in the future. Other validity issues, they had quantitative data. it doesn't have much scope for interpretation error, and therefore not influenced by subjectivity and hopefully more valid. On the minus side of the validity argument, we have order effects. Order effects. Doing the Van Halen second time around, having been asked to change from the Breathatech inhaler, would have made the research aims obvious to the parents and the children, you would think, which might have led to the experimental effect influence the outcome. And on the flip side of the quantitative data, we had very little no qualitative data. They weren't asked the reasons behind their increased they weren't asked the reasons behind their increased adherence or compliance. It may have had nothing to do with the funhaler. I guess we'll never know. Next up, a little bit of reliability action, if you haven't already. Whip up your two tables, think up two positives in terms of what makes each study reliable, two negatives is in terms of what makes each study unreliable, and we'll be right back. Okay, so we're on to our old friend reliability, aka consistency, aka if you were to do the experiment again, would you get similar results? If somebody else do the experiment again, would they get similar results? Bandura, clearly the more controlled something is, the more likely it is to be replicable. If it is replicable in the same way, the more likely you are to have similar results. It was a lab experiment, the same procedure was followed for all participants. Extraneous variables were therefore kept the same, wouldn't have influenced the outcome, so therefore that would have made it pretty reliable. The observation was very scientific, using a coding system, time sampling, every 20 seconds for 20 minutes, producing 240 time observations, if memory serves, at reduced subjectivity of deciding when to put down an observation, as with a event sample, and also there's high inter-rate reliability. All the things suggest it would be quite highly reliable. On the minus side, quite a major issue with Bandura is, despite the fact that his entire sample was 72, there were actually only 6 participants in each mini experimental condition. So one child having a bad day or a good day would have influenced the entire outcome. And although the violence was stylized and so well controlled, reliability does depend on the model being able to perform the same actions time and time and time again, and other models being able to perform those same actions too. It's easier because it was clearly laid down, lay the doll on its side, sit on it, hit on the head, etc. But it still requires an element of consistency by the models, which may or may not have existed. Chaney, of course, the same questions on the questionnaire, standardised instructions, etc. So it's highly replicable, and reliability would have been fairly good for that sake. Again, they got quantitative data. There's less scope for error in interpretation, less scope for subjectivity influencing the outcome. That would make it more reliable. On the minus side, it was a field study, so it open to the influence of extraneous variables. What if it had been somebody's birthday the day before? The phone call was made to see if they'd adhered, and they spent all day at a party or something like that. That's not something that would have happened in a lab, and it's something that's going to influence the outcome that couldn't be controlled by the experimenters, reducing reliability. And finally, our old chum with self-report measures is that people can always lie on questionnaires. Often it's assumed they'd lie to please the experimenter, but it may also engage in the screw you effect. If we don't know which one was which, then other times that people might lie in a different way, meaning that reliability would be reduced. Next up, ethnocentrism. If you haven't already, give yourself a pause, whip down your tables, think of 2 positives that suggest the studies wouldn't be ethnocentric, 2 things that suggest the studies might be ethnocentric, and we'll be right back. So now we're on to ethnocentrism, and before we get our thoughts down on paper about why the studies may or may not have been ethnocentric, I just want to have a little moment to remind you that ethnocentrism has two parts to it. First of all, is the sample representative of and therefore generalizable to a range of ethnic groups? If not, then it's centered on the ethnic groups it's studying and it's more ethnocentric. And secondly, is the behaviour being studied being considered from the viewpoint of a particular ethnic group? If it is assumed that whatever behaviour you're looking at, aggression, conformity, etc., is a good thing, it's going to be embraced. Other social groups may consider those things slightly differently, either even more positively or more negatively, which means that we're interpreting the behaviours we're studying in a certain way due to our own ethnicities. So just to give an example of interpreting things through the eyes of different ethnic groups, I used to teach a study which looked at emoticons. Emoticons are a bit like old school emojis, only they were drawn instead of the pictorial ones that we've got on our phone nowadays. And here's a kind of example I put up, and you can see very simple eyes, crosses, little half circles going down, circles, and the different straight lines and the different shapes of the eyes represent certain moods. At the same time, you've got different shapes of mouths representing different moods as well. And it was found that when comparing judgments of what the emoticons were expressing, that some cultures looked more at the eyes and other cultures looked more at the mouths. Now, that kind of suggests perhaps we do that in the flesh, that some cultures try and judge emotion through what the mouth is doing, other cultures judge facial emotions more through what the eyes are doing, and that means that we would interpret emotions perhaps a little bit differently. And the results of something like our old friend Baron Cohen's study of reading the mind and the eyes task would be very different across different cultures. So now you know what to do. If you haven't already, whip up your two tables, two positives about why a study isn't ethnocentric. Not being ethnocentric is a positive in this case. Two negatives about why a study would have been ethnocentric, and then we'll get to my answers. Bandura, not ethnocentric because there would have been a range of ethnicities at the university. It's a large teaching institution and different ethnicities would have been represented there even back in 1961. Another issue with ethnocentrism and Bandura is that the urge to violence may be cross-cultural. One of our closest relatives, the chimpanzees, can be extremely aggressive. Humans are historically predators. We've got our binocular vision. We've got our canines, right? We eat other animals as a sort of evolutionary thing. So perhaps looking at aggression is something that would apply equally to all cultures. So why isn't it ethnocentric? Well, it was Stanford University in the early 1960s. At that time, 43% of whites became high school graduates, but only 20% of blacks did. That's not going to be truly representative across people going into Stanford University, is it? At that time, 11.4% of males got a degree, just out of interest, and 6.7% of females, so therefore there are twice as many male academics as female academics. Interestingly, today, 32.6% of white people get a college degree in America, and 19.6% of black people get a college degree in America. So it's still, you would think, is not as culturally diverse as you would think. Another problem is that, having said that, there is an evolutionary tendency towards aggression in the human race. Perhaps not all cultures do have the same attitudes to aggression. Bandura seemed to take the viewpoint that aggression was a bad thing. But is that true? Is that really thought of in Western cultures? The number of people like boxing or cage fighting or violent video games, clearly shows that we are quite an aggressive culture. Are some cultures more peaceful, less aggressive than ours? Are some cultures more aggressive than ours? I don't know. But the point is that until we do, we can't be sure that the study is not ethnocentric. Okay, what about Chaney then? Well, it happened in Australia. It happened over a wide geographical and socio-economic area, so hopefully a range of ethnicities and groups of people would have been represented. And secondly, I like to think that most children, whatever culture they grew up in, would have quite enjoyed blowing something that made whizzing noises and made balls rattle and stuff. I know I would have done. So therefore, it is perhaps cross-cultural to that degree in that, everybody would have viewed that as reward and fun, etc. On the negative side, the samples are all from Australia, so may not be representative to other countries. Australians are very used to health warnings, particularly regarding skin cancer, etc. As a famous slip, slap, slop slogan and this, that and the other. Perhaps they're more influenced by those messages because they're more used to them, or perhaps the opposite is true. And some cultural groups are undoubtedly far more obedient to authority than others. So therefore, those different cultures would be more or less adherent in the first place, and the findings might not be generalizable to them anyway. Over to sampling issues, you know what to do. Pause me for a second and then we will leap straight into it. Okay, Bandura, sampling, good point. Equal number of boys and girls, so that it's representative to both genders. It's not androcentric, that's all good. Next up, there's a matched pairs design, which reduced the effect of participant variables on the outcome, and so this helps to overcome problems with sample size. There may only been relatively small sample sizes, but at least those samples were matched, so they were less likely to have been influenced by some of them being more aggressive than others. On the minus side, it was an opportunity to sample of those who were going to the university nursery. That means that they were probably not very representative of the average children. They're all children of academics. They're all children of working academics. So that means that they weren't typical of every American family. So there are only 6 people, being not terribly representative and therefore not generalizable. Also, those groups being very easily swayed by participant variables. And whilst we know that they were matched to either aggressive or passive or control, we don't know how those matched went into male, female, etc., etc. So there may have been an imbalance there. And last but not least, Chaney's sampling issues. Well, I've got to apologise to a few of you here who put on your work that you sent me similar to what was in the book, that the sample was random, and I wasn't 100% certain it was, but I've since looked it up and it really was random. So sorry about that. You were right, and that means it's less likely to be biased. There's a range of ages, a range of genders, so generalisable to more children. On the minus side, they're all from Western Australia, not the most diverse country in the world, and there was only 32 kids looked at, not an enormous sample. They themselves said it was a pilot study to start off with, so we can't be 100% sure it was all generalisable and stuff. So there's some ideas. Next up, we're going to be looking at some exam questions and breaking down how to get those marks, and a lot of those validity issues are going to come in handy in doing that. So see you then.